The traditional tale surrounding the murder of King Henry VI is starkly clear. On the night of May 21st to May 22nd, 1471, the twice-deposed monarch knelt in prayer in the chapel of Wakefield Tower within the Tower of London. It was likely between 11 p.m. and midnight. Despite being only 49 years old, Henry was by then a frail and broken man, worn down by illness and repeated losses. As he was sunken into deep prayer, a blow to the back of his head shattered his skull, relieving his soul from this world. However, historian Lauren Johnson challenges this narrative in her outstanding 2019 biography of Henry VI. She notes that anyone carefully examining the primary sources will quickly realize that this account was not the version passed down over the centuries. None of the information is undisputed. Indeed, the circumstances surrounding Henry VI's murder, or Henry of Windsor, as he was known at the time of his death, remain unresolved to this day. Consequently, neither Edward IV nor Richard III, who are frequently implicated as either the direct perpetrators or at least responsible parties, have been definitively proven guilty. This ambiguity warrants a closer investigation of the historical sources and the 1910 examination of Henry's mortal remains. It also requires grappling with the contentious debates about the details of his death to draw meaningful conclusions. While Edward IV bears significant responsibility, as will be demonstrated, Richard III cannot entirely escape scrutiny as well, though his culpability may be less important. As part of the conclusion, I will share an interesting story dealing with Henry's spirit and two boys. Recently, someone asked me under a video if I would consider making a video about people contacting the ghost of Richard III. While I am not the best person for this kind of content, I can offer a tale about the ghost of Henry VI and the princes in the tower. I don't believe it to be true, but it's certainly entertaining. The central question before everyone else is, was it murder at all? A contemporary source close to the House of York offers a striking denial. In the eyewitness account known as the History of the Arrival of Edward IV in England and the final recovery of his kingdoms from Henry VI, it is stated that Henry died of pure displeasure and melancholy. According to this version, the death of his son, Edward of Westminster, the capture of his wife, Margaret of Anjou, and the complete collapse of his government drove Henry to his end. To this day, many, including myself, view this explanation as propaganda. Only a few, primarily within Ricardian circles, have entertained it. Philippa Langley, in her book on the Princes in the Tower, suggests it as a possibility. We will deal with her account later. Similarly, Matthew Lewis considers the idea but ultimately dismisses it. He writes, "It should be remembered that Henry was 49 and had been in poor mental and physical health for at least 18 years by this point. Whilst it cannot be dismissed out of hand, it remains an unlikely explanation." Other sources from the time provide a very different perspective. The Milanese ambassador to the French royal court, Sforza di Bettini, reported to his duke, "King Edward has not chosen to have the custody of King Henry any longer, although he was in some sense innocent, and there was no great fear about his proceedings, the prince his son and the Earl of Warwick being dead, as well as all those who were for him and had any vigour, as he has caused King Henry to be secretly assassinated in the Tower, where he was a prisoner. He has, in short, chosen to crush the seed." John Walkworth's chronicle, written in July 1472, also claims, "And the same night that King Edward came to London, King Henry being inward, in prison in the Tower of London, was put to death the 21st day of May, on a Tuesday night, between 11 and 12 of the clock, being then at the Tour the Duke of Gloucester, brother to King Edward and many others." Later traditions added further embellishments, including references to Richard's Shakespearean Hunchback, likely a subsequent insertion. During the Tudor era, the account of Richard being the murderer gained even more traction. For example, Robert Fabian recorded, "Of the death of this prince, diverse tales were told, but the most common fame went that he was sticked with a dagger by the hands of the Duke of Gloucester." Thomas More echoed this claim, attributing Henry's death to Richard. Over time, Tudor authors solidified an interpretation of events that many Ricardians partially accept even today. Edward IV ordered Henry's death, and Richard, acting on behalf of his brother, carried out the deed. The latter point, however, remains the subject of heated debate, which I will address later. Before delving into the developments of the 20th century and beyond, we must mention three significant events from the 15th century. First, Edward initially had Henry buried at Chertsey Abbey in Surrey. Before this, Henry's body was laid out in London for several days, likely to prove to the public that the former king had indeed died. Second, a cult dedicated to Henry formed surprisingly early. By 1473, Edward was compelled to ban unauthorized pilgrimages within England. A recorded miracle attributed to Henry occurred as early as 1481. Third, in 1484, Richard III reburied Henry at Windsor Castle, interring him in St. George's Chapel. Here, Henry rests alongside Edward IV. While Henry had originally wished to be buried in Westminster, his nephew Henry VII tried to make it happen but ultimately abandoned these plans. Today, a modern statue at Westminster Abbey commemorates Henry VI. The reasons for Richard's reburial of Henry remain unclear due to an unfortunate lack of surviving documentation. Speculative theories range from Richard's personal or familial guilt to a desire to accommodate the cult of Henry VI. Another plausible explanation, which I believe merits a certain consideration, is Richard's aspiration to end the Wars of the Roses. By burying his brother and the last Lancastrian king in the same chapel, Richard may have sought to symbolize unity. I will discuss this question further in the part about Edward's and Richard's potential guilt. Here and now I have to add one more thing. It is possible that Henry's body was damaged during its relocation, or deliberately divided, leaving some bones at Chertsey Abbey. When Henry's grave at Windsor was opened on November 4, 1910, his right arm bones were notably missing. This brings us directly to the examinations conducted on Henry VI's body, which have been sharply criticized in the years since. However, let us begin with the findings of William Henry St. John Hope, Canon John Neil Dalton, and Dr. Alexander McAllister. The men were initially uncertain whether they had opened the correct grave, as Henry's tomb had been relocated due to modifications in the chapel's access routes. After their examination, however, they expressed confidence in their identification. St. John Hope noted in his 1911 report, "There is no other person than King Henry VI recorded or known to have been buried in St. George's Chapel, to whom remains enclosed in so remarkable a way could possibly belong." St. John Hope also remarked on a particularly striking detail, which is probably the most famous part of the whole investigation. One feature was noticeable, that to one of the pieces of the skull there was still attached some of the hair, which was brown in color, save in one place where it was much darker and apparently matted with blood. Based on this observation, he concluded that Henry may have died a violent death. Dr. McAllister's report provided additional insights. The bones of the head were unfortunately much broken, but as far as they could be pieced together, they were thin and light, and belonged to a skull well formed but small in proportion to the stature. Some of the roof bones, occipital and temporal, frontal and parietal, had become ossified together at the sutures. The few teeth found, second molar upper right and first molar upper left, second bicuspid lower right, had their crowns very much worn down. The portion of the one side of the lower jaw found had lost its teeth some time before death. There were nearly all the bones of the trunk, of both legs, and of the left arm, but I found no part of the right arm. From the relative positions occupied by the bones, as they lay in the leaden casket when opened, it was certain that the body had been dismembered when it was put in. If the body had been buried in the earth for some time and then exhumed, it would account for their being in the condition in which we found them. It might also account for the absence of the bones of the right arm, as well as for the accidental enclosure of the left humerus of a small pig within the casket. I am sorry that I can add nothing more. The state of the bones was so unsatisfactory that I could not make any trustworthy measurements. Dr. McAllister, a professor of anatomy at Cambridge, was the only expert present whose background lent significant weight to his observations. St. John Hope, by contrast, was a historian of architecture, raising doubts about his ability to identify blood on hair, a claim frequently questioned, particularly by Ricardians. Similarly, Canon John Neil Dalton lacked the necessary expertise to evaluate the remains. As historian Mary Clive later observed, the only qualified expert, McAllister, made no mention of bloody hair, and did not conclude that Henry's skull had been smashed as a result of a violent act. In the 1980s, Ricardian historian W.J. White went so far as to dismiss the bloody hair as an invention of St. John Hope. This accusation seems excessive. The examinations were conducted in front of several witnesses, and no one contradicted the claim that the hair existed. Furthermore, I have not encountered a single credible source asserting that the presence of bloody hair on Henry's skull would have been impossible. As for why an architectural historian like St. John Hope was involved in the first place, his expertise was crucial in identifying the correct location of Henry's tomb, given the various alterations to the chapel's layout over the years. In conclusion, the original sources, with only one exception, indicate that Henry VI was murdered. The only dissenting account is heavily propagandistic in tone. The 1910 examinations, while not definitive, provide support for the likelihood of a violent death. Based on the evidence available to us today, it is reasonable to conclude that Henry VI did not die of natural causes. While absolute certainty remains elusive, absent any compelling new evidence, we must assume that Henry VI was indeed murdered. Therefore, the next critical question is, when was Henry murdered? As noted earlier, one source cites the night of Edward IV's return to London, specifically the night of May 21st to May 22nd. However, this interpretation has faced opposition, notably from Sir Clements Markham, who challenged this timeline. Markham pointed to the Exchequer issue rolls, which detail expenses incurred during Henry's final days in the Tower. According to these records, Henry was still alive at least until May 24th. A key entry mentions a payment to William Sayer. It reads, "To William Sayer, Esquire, in money paid him for the expenses and diet of the said Henry, for 14 days, the first day beginning the 11th of May last past." If Sayer's payment covered 2 weeks starting on May 11th, this would extend beyond May 21st, suggesting Henry was alive after Edward's return. For Markham's argument to hold, we would have to assume that the payment for Sayer was recorded on the very day of Henry's death. However, this assumption encounters a practical issue. It is far more likely that Edward's immediate priority would have been arranging Henry's funeral rather than addressing Sayer's expenses. This has led some historians to advocate for May 23 as the date of death, a position also found in the York-friendly source that attributes Henry's death to melancholy. Many Ricardians favour this timeline because it potentially absolves Richard, Duke of Gloucester, of involvement. Richard departed London on May 22nd to confront rebels led by Thomas Neville. If Henry died on May 23rd, Richard could not have been present, thereby clearing him of suspicion. The credibility of the York-friendly source, however, is questionable. As previously discussed, the claim that Henry died of melancholy lacks supporting evidence and is likely propaganda. If we doubt this narrative, we must also scrutinize its timeline, especially since no other sources corroborate it. Furthermore, 2 other 15th century accounts mention that Henry died on a Wednesday. However, May 23rd, 1471, was a Thursday. This discrepancy suggests that these 2 sources were actually referring to Wednesday, May 22nd. Given that the Warkworth Chronicle from 1472 specifies an assassination between 11 p.m. and midnight, it is plausible that Henry's death occurred late on May 21st, but was officially reported after midnight, thus falling on May 22nd. The York-friendly source may have deliberately cited May 23rd as the date of death to exonerate Richard. By claiming Henry died the day after Richard had left London, suspicions against the York brothers could be mitigated. As with the murder itself, the exact date of Henry VI's death cannot be determined with absolute certainty. The various traditions offer conflicting information. However, the available evidence strongly points to the night of May 21st to May 22nd as the most likely time frame. Based on this timeline, neither Edward IV nor Richard can be entirely absolved of involvement. While uncertainties remain, the weight of evidence leans toward this date. As noted earlier, Henry VI is said to have been murdered in the chapel of the Wakefield Tower. It was known that the king liked to pray in this location. Originally, these premises were constructed as royal apartments for Henry III and Edward I. However, after the St. Thomas Tower, dedicated to Thomas Becket, was built shortly afterward, the royal bedchamber was relocated there. The throne of Henry III, now present in the Wakefield Tower as a replica, likely disappeared during this transition. For some time, the Wakefield Tower was repurposed as a council chamber. It was in this capacity that it housed the original of the throne, which you can see today. Adjacent to the Wakefield Tower, accommodations were constructed in the Garden Tower, which would later become infamous as the Bloody Tower, but that new name is a development for a later period. A key issue complicates the traditional narrative. Edward IV had little practical use for the Wakefield Tower during his reign. Under his authority, it was primarily used for storage, making it unlikely that Henry was housed there. However, this does not entirely preclude the possibility that Henry used the chapel for prayer. Nevertheless, such a scenario becomes less likely given the Wakefield Tower's primary function at the time. Adding to the uncertainty is the absence of any alternative location where Henry might have been accommodated during his imprisonment in the latter half of the 1460s. It is only recorded that Henry resided in the royal apartments and was permitted to receive visitors. Despite this, I believe the Wakefield Tower remains a plausible location for several reasons. First, there is the expansive vault beneath the Wakefield Tower, which appears to have been used for storage. The apartments themselves, once suitable living quarters, could only be accessed via the wall. The vault, however, was accessible from Cold Harbor, meaning from the inside of the tower walls. Even today, the former entrance's location is identifiable from the variations in the stonework. For practical reasons, this vault would have been a more convenient storage space than the upper chambers. Second, the specific historical context must be considered. During Henry's brief restoration to the throne, the Tower of London had been designated as the planned birthplace of Edward V, a plan ultimately disrupted by these events. Lancaster troops, aware of this, thoroughly searched the entire tower complex. This likely disturbed its functions, including the storage arrangements. Later, upon Edward IV's return to London, the tower was fortified for defense against potential threats from the Yorkist forces. Using one of the central towers, such as Wakefield Tower, for storage during this period of military readiness would have been impractical. In summary, while the evidence for Henry's presence in the Wakefield Tower is inconclusive, there are compelling arguments in its favor. At the very least, it seems possible that Henry used the chapel for prayer. However, the stone placed in the chapel, bearing the inscription that the king died there by tradition, nails it. Henry's fractured skull is often cited as evidence that he met his end by a violent blow. According to tradition, the dagger used in the murder was kept for many years in the chapel of Our Lady Caversham, where it was particularly venerated by Elizabeth of York. In 1537, it is said to have been confiscated by John Stokesley, Bishop of London, during Thomas Cromwell's suppression of relics. After this, the dagger's trace disappears. However, alternative theories about Henry's death began circulating as early as the 15th century. One claim suggested that he had been suffocated in his bed. In France, it was reported that he died of porphyry, a condition believed to have contributed to his lifelong health problems. Meanwhile, the Crowland Chronicle offers no details about the method of his murder, but firmly asserts the act itself. I shall say nothing at this time about the discovery of King Henry's lifeless body in the Tower of London. May God have mercy upon and give time for repentance to him, whoever it might be, who dared to lay sacrilegious hands on the Lord's anointed. And so let the doer merit the title of tyrant, and the victim that of glorious martyr. The term tyrant is often interpreted as a thinly veiled reference to Richard III, though this interpretation is not conclusive. Later theories speculated that Henry's skull was so fragile that even a simple fall could have caused his death. However, this idea is challenged by his longevity. If Henry's physical condition had been so precarious, it seems unlikely he would have survived until 1471. All of these theories align with McAllister's findings from the 1910 examination, underscoring the frustrating reality. We simply do not know how Henry's life ended. Unlike earlier discussions in this video, I cannot confidently assert that a blow to the skull is the most likely cause of death. The sources are too contradictory, and there is a compelling argument that the murderers would have sought to avoid methods that made it blatantly obvious that Henry had been killed. A blow to the skull would have posed precisely that risk. Another question arises. Why was Henry murdered at this particular time? Edward IV had allowed him to live for years and treated him relatively well. A source from the time of Henry's reinstatement mentions that he was not treated entirely as befitted a king. However, this account aimed to discredit Edward IV, so its credibility is questionable. The motives for Henry's murder invariably relate to Edward's rule. The most common theory is that the first Yorkist king spared his predecessor initially out of kindness. However, Henry's brief reinstatement demonstrated to Edward that the Lancastrian monarch remained a threat to him and his family as long as he lived. Supporters of this view often cite a statement Henry reportedly made upon Edward's return. "My cousin of York, you are very welcome. I know that in your hands my life will not be in danger." This remark is interpreted not only as naive, but also as a pointed refusal to address Edward as king. According to this theory, Edward realized that Henry did not accept his legitimacy and decided to eliminate him. This interpretation has been challenged, with some suggesting that Henry's fragile mental state might explain why he failed to address Edward properly. A more sinister theory proposes that Henry's weak mental health made him an ideal figurehead for the Lancastrian cause. From Edward's perspective, Henry's death might pave the way for a more capable leader, such as Henry's son, Edward of Westminster. He was approaching the age at which Edward IV himself had claimed the throne and could have posed a serious threat. Killing Henry might have risked provoking opposition in Europe as well, so the Yorkists may have chosen to let him live for pragmatic reasons. By May 1471, however, the situation had shifted. Edward of Westminster and other key Lancastrian leaders were dead, and Margaret of Anjou was in captivity. Henry Tudor was merely a child, whose tenuous claim to the throne was widely disregarded. Even the children of Edward IV's sister Elizabeth arguably had equal or stronger claims to the throne than Henry Tudor. At this point, there was little reason to keep Henry alive. In my view, the decision to kill Henry stemmed from a combination of these motives. Henry had demonstrated his enduring symbolic value as a figurehead for the Lancastrians. By this time, however, his death carried few risks, apart from the potential for negative reactions from European monarchs. Edward likely calculated that such reactions would be muted, and he was proven correct. This brings us nearly to the conclusion and the central question of this discussion. Who is responsible for Henry VI's death? Was it Edward IV, Richard III, or both brothers acting together? For anyone who believes Henry was murdered, one fact is unavoidable. Henry would never have been killed without Edward IV's approval. As the first Yorkist king, Edward must have ordered his death and bears the primary responsibility. I align with this interpretation. But was Richard also involved? There is one significant factor that has not yet been addressed. Richard was Lord High Constable of England. If Edward ordered Henry's death while Richard was still in London, Richard would have been officially responsible for overseeing the act. This aligns with the account of John Walkworth, who wrote that Henry was murdered while Richard was present at the Tower. The question of Richard's involvement has notably divided Ricardians. Older Ricardians, such as Paul Murray Kendall, maintain that Edward ordered the murder and that Richard, as a loyal brother, oversaw the deed. According to this view, Richard did not personally kill Henry, but was present in the Tower to confirm that the deed was carried out. This interpretation aligns with the suggestion that Richard later felt a guilty conscience, which may have prompted him to move Henry's remains to a more dignified resting place. In contrast, some modern Ricardians reject this notion. Philippa Langley, for example, and as mentioned above, proposes an alternative explanation in her book, suggesting that Henry indeed died of melancholy, a term historically used for emotional distress, but which she argues corresponds to a sudden heart attack in modern terms. Other contemporary Ricardians, like Matthew Lewis, have echoed this idea, proposing that Henry's death was a natural result of shock upon hearing devastating news. Langley's argument likely hinges on the date of Henry's death. Since the York Friendly Chronicle records his death on May 23rd, not May 24th, as Langley inaccurately claims, the timeline becomes significant. By May 23rd, Richard was no longer in London. If we follow Langley, this would absolve Richard entirely. He couldn't have killed Henry, since the king wasn't murdered. And even if he would have been murdered, Richard wasn't anywhere the Tower. What is striking about Langley's account is the absence of Richard's name in connection with Henry's death. It is as if Richard is deliberately separated from Edward and his government in her narrative, suggesting an intent to distance him from the events surrounding the Lancastrian king's demise. As Lord High Constable of England, Richard very much was a part of Edward's government. It is worth noting that Langley offers no concrete evidence for the claim that melancholy in that era referred to a sudden form of heart failure. While her text includes footnotes, they do not substantiate this specific assertion. Instead, her interpretation seems shaped to fit her broader argument, which other modern Ricardians have embraced. For this reason, I emphasize that not all Ricardians share this view. Earlier Ricardian assessments were often more critically balanced and realistic. To conclude, I agree with Kendall's assessment. Edward ordered Henry's death. Whether he coordinated this decision with Richard or others is ultimately irrelevant. As king, the decision rested with him alone. Richard, who was still in London and held the position of Lord High Constable, was responsible for supervising the execution. This task was far too critical and sensitive to be entrusted to anyone Edward did not completely trust. The Yorkist king knew he could rely on his younger brother even for such delicate matters, which is why he assigned him this significant commission. I do not believe that Richard personally ended Henry's life, but instead delegated the task to appropriate individuals. The exact circumstances of Henry's death remain unclear, but I think it is likely that the events took place in Wakefield Tower. Additionally, I believe Richard later moved Henry's tomb to address the growing cult surrounding the former king. My personal theory is that this relocation was tied to the death of Richard's son, Edward of Middleham. Many viewed Richard's personal tragedies, including the loss of his heir, as divine retribution for his path to the throne. This perception extended not only to the princes in the Tower, but also to Henry VI. In my view, the relocation of Henry's tomb was an attempt by Richard to make amends. Now, as promised, the ghost story. Henry's cult quickly gave rise to numerous tales about the spirit of the last Lancastrian king. Not all of these stories painted the monarch in a positive light. For instance, it was said that Henry harmed John Robins for insulting Saint Henry, resulting in Robins losing his eyesight. Henry's possible place of death, Wakefield Tower, stood right next to the Bloody Tower, where the princes would live 12 years later. According to the cult's legends, Henry's spirit had been especially active during that time. Having lost a son to Edward IV, who would have more reason than Henry to draw Edward's sons to him in vengeance? This might even explain why the bodies of the princes were never found. While I don't personally believe in ghost stories, I can understand the fascination such a narrative holds. The idea of Henry's spirit seeking justice or revenge against the sons of his murderer certainly adds an eerie and compelling layer to the story. Wouldn't you agree? Thanks for watching! Please like and subscribe to support this channel.